Okay, I'm going to try to touch upon creation itself and see if I can piss off about 80% of the people that listen to my stuff. Surely we all have an open mind, and so we'll try to get through this as well as we can. But this is what I have found, and I'll show you some variations and just looks at it. We're just going to stand over here and look at it. We're going to stand over there and look at it. We're going to do a few aspects of it. We can see definitely that our idea from what is depicted in the Bible has changed dramatically from what is depicted in the Bible. Now, a lot of people say, no, no, it's the same thing, and I can see how you can misconstrue, or you can take an idea and a concept and go, oh, well, it meant this, whenever it clearly meant that. Let's not try to just destroy everything. Let's show the reality of everything, if I can. And maybe with a slight bit of kid gloves, but you know me, I don't usually have them on. In the Bible, it's depicted as a very self-centered place. It's depicted as being as Earth is the center of the universe. Everything's all about me and us. Now that we know the vast size of the universe, we have come up with this idea of a Big Bang, which would look a lot like this symbology here, which looks very reminiscent of the pillars of creation, which if you turn it on its side looks more like the hand of God. And they tell you that this is a star nursery. This is where stars are formed. Now, in the ancient Cosmos series that I grew up with the late great Carl Sagan, he described how we were all star stuff. That the elements that make up our body all come from stars being created, but not the creation of the star, the death of the star, and its rapid and extreme heat and dispersal of itself causes other elements to spontaneously be formed. This is somewhat of a theory we still have, but it shows to be somewhat true. Although a lot of stars are believed to have somewhat of an iron core to them, and a lot of other things, that is also where we get that from, and so on. So we also had this belief, of course, that whenever we're in elder times, that these stars that were attached to a firmament, which in the Bible is described as a hammered out plate that holds up the water that's in space. It's the way it's described. And there's waters below us too, and God's also made that. Now these are the firmament concept, and it holds it back. But sometimes, I'm guessing due to God's will, some of these stars just fall out of the sky. And we know now, of course, that if a star fell, a star is many, many more times, the smallest form of star is many, many more times the size of Earth. And so that couldn't be really the effect. In fact, due to gravity, we would be falling into them. They wouldn't fall to Earth. And we know falling stars now are meteorites. And of course, meteorites were deified back in the day quite a bit. There was one up in Greece that they had that was extremely famous. They had one in Egypt that they even made King Tut's daggers out of, and so on. And I'm not going to go into the meteoric aspect of this, but just the concept of falling stars. And the concept that they used to believe that the sun wasn't 93 million miles away, but was inside of this dome, this crystal dome called the firmament, and the sun and the moon were the same size, and they were spinning around inside this dome, the dome itself covered with sparklies that were pretty much like the bubbles you see trapped in glass when you make glass. And it's kind of shows you an idea of where they even had this idea to come from. Swirling bubbles off ponds, and then you look up at the sky, and at nighttime you look at that same pond and you see a reflection of the sky, and you kind of go, hey, get some ideas. But we've hopefully mentally gone somewhat less possessive of the idea that it was all about us. And now we have this idea of it being somewhat a Big Bang, like is depicted here, that was God. Now, of course, in the ancient picture that this is mocking, the one on the left was supposed to have been us, the one on the right was the hand of God, giving us the spark of life. I could go into a lot about concepts like that too, and ancient wizards and mages who would rub a rod of ivory or perhaps amber on wool, and it would develop an extreme spark, like when you rub your feet around on the carpet the wrong time of year, right? And you touch somebody, and they would do this thing and then go out to reach for your hand whenever you would touch them. That, oh, I'm sorry, the power of God's in me, and all these things that they would pull off. It's the magicians. Egypt had magicians that pulled off the first 3 of Moses's tricks, and casting snakes out of sticks and everything. They were able to pull this off. So, and it's strange that God would have them go and make a bunch of fake little magic tricks that he would see through, but of course it was supposedly to harden his heart and all these concepts. We'll get to that here in just a moment, but this touching of God that you see here, that seems to be God reaching us and touching out to us, could also be symbolized in the fact of the planet was going for a long time, and finally God reached us. The idea of God, the concept of God. Now, many people have noticed a long time ago that in some of these ancient artworks, they show you certain things, and of course Da Vinci Code and all these things, and showing you the Sistine Chapel. And a lot of people have noted that this is actually a brain, even though it's meant to be God's big cape, which mimics somehow Mithra's big cape that domes over the sky, but that God's here reaching out and about to touch mankind. And a strange scene here. A lot of people have picked this totally apart. I'm just going to say one thing about it, that from the mind, from the third eye coming out through, just like Athena was spawned forth from Zeus, the spawning forth idea gave a spark of life to man. Now, in this story, man was created, and then God breathed a breath of life, and there was a belief in wind. God was in a sacred wind. This is known as Ruach, and it's the sacred wind. So a totally different concept than the spark or shock of life. This is more of a Indo-European type concept of the spark or concept, because we realize that, you hit your funny bone and all these things, that there's electricalness that's all through you. And then of course the storm gods and their electricity, and you can see that shit, and it's real, it's in front of you. In elder times, it was hard to see something that really was probably from God. You saw something like lightning strike stuff and great storms, and you go, yeah, there's the finger of God, right? Strangely, in his depiction, it looks like he's resting back and kind of daydreaming. And in his daydream, he, in his mind, is creating the concept of God, and that sparks forth thoughts that lead to our current belief systems, and we still cling on to today, that have a lot of basis in fact and truth and reality, but yet come from this primordial idea of mankind searching from what's the reason for us here, why are we so advanced than the other creatures, what could have happened, why is it the way that it is. When we look into the Genesis creation narrative, it's a creation myth of both Judaism and Christianity. Those are, of course, interwoven, though there are people that go, no, the Old Testament, this is the thing, and all that type deal. It all comes from the same thing, and in fact, most of it comes from actual Sumerian religions and some intertwining of Egyptian thoughts pulled together with the Canaanite religion of the time. And I'll try to show that to you here a little bit simply and break through a few of the myths that are around this. Now, the narrative is made up of 2 stories, roughly equivalent to the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis. In the first, the Elohim, which is the Hebrew generic word for God, but it actually is plural and means a council of gods, so it shows there are more than one involved. Hopefully I'll have time to show you here in a moment there is a council of gods. He creates the heavens and earth in 6 days, then he rests on and blessed and sanctifies the 7th day. In the second story, God, now referred to by the personal name of Yahweh, creates Adam, the first man, from dust and places him in the Garden of Eden, where he's given dominion over the animals. Eve, the first woman, is created from Adam and as his companion. This is echoing a Sumerian tale where they had created man from the dust of the earth, or the Afar, and in doing so made Adamu, which was known as primordial man to them. This was their concept first, and Ninti, Lady of the Rib, was involved in the ceremony. And so you can see whenever they pull in this rib concept and everything with the Bible, and how Eve supposedly grows from a rib and then eats from a magic tree because a talking snake told her to, where that kind of comes from. And I'll show you a few more things that'll interweave this idea of Eve. Now, Eve also can be seen as Inanna in the Sumerian concepts, and there's Inanna in the Halupa tree, in this tree of life. In the Gilgamesh stories, there's this source of life, and he even sources out Utnapishtim, who is the original Noah, who was told about the flood, built an ark himself, and then saved mankind by doing so through the god Enki, known as Ea, E-A, or Ea, or Yah, and this god that controls the tides and so on, who also is known as Yah, as a moon god to the Egyptians, who controls tides as the moon controls the tides, and we realize all this now, is seen as Ea, or Enki. Enki was known as the Lord of the Earth at one time, and then was taken over by beliefs in a sky god system that was over things. I'll try to give you an example how that comes about, of them being over each other.
What gods do you pray to?
I pray to the four winds. And you?
To Trump? But I seldom pray to him. He doesn't listen.
Now, Crom is a great mountain god in his concepts, and of course Kron, you put the us on the end of it for deifying in Greek and Roman times, and that's Kronos. This is the idea. Concepts are seen woven into this ancient Sumerian idea, right? This Conan, this Sumerian, which also leads to a different place. But listen to what Subotai says.
What good is he then? Yeah, it's just as I've always said.
He's strong. If I die, I have to go before him. And he will ask me, what is the riddle of steel? If I don't know it, he will cast me out of Valhalla and laugh at me. That's Crom. Strong in his mountain.
So he tells you that he has to go before him. Now he pulls in, whenever they do the Conan story here, the gods of Valhalla and the ancients, and that if he doesn't know the rule of steel, they will kick him out. It's a secret you have to know to get into heaven. like the secrets in the Egyptians you had to know to get into heaven. All that's been kind of taken away with this monotheology, though, and the idea that all you have to do is believe in Jesus. See, before the Jesus thing, it was harder to get into heaven than to get through the eye of a needle. Right? This concept. But Subutai tells you that his sky god is greater than his mountain god. Subutai wearing the pointy Phrygian cap here. Let's see what he says.
My God is greater.
From laughs at the four winds. Not from his mountain.
My God is stronger. He is the everlasting sky. Your God lives underneath it.
Aha! Maybe we can see how one people can talk crap about another people's God, and you can see how easily this can get taken out of hand. Priests or prophets trying to meet each other from certain places, and other people in ancient times getting very pissed off hearing that their God is over their God. This leads to a concept of Most High God, and everyone searched for the Most High God. The Sumerians knew the Most High God, our farthest away planet, visible to humans, was Saturn. And so Saturn is seen as the Most High God, and you can see the rings on Saturn being deified as a halo over people. There's also rampant sun god worship, because everyone knows the sun makes everything grow. It dries up the wet waters. You know, the sun even causes clouds to form. Those clouds cause rain. The sun causes the largest straight constant effect on the planet. People can see this, and there's a day and a night, though, and the scaredness of night versus the confidence of the day. During the day, you can't even see the stars or the gods. They're invisible. But during the night, they reveal themselves, and people can take into ideas, pictures, and constellations, and come up with concepts, come up with different idealisms off of this. Conan is contemplating this on the Tree of Woe, which ironically looks just like being sacrificed. Now it tells you here that borrowing things from Mesopotamian mythology, but adapting them to the Israelites' belief in one God, the first major comprehensive draft of the Pentateuch, or the series of 5 books which begins with Genesis and ends with Deuteronomy, was composed in the late 7th to 6th century BC. The Yahwist source was later expanded by other authors, the priestly source, in some 385 BC and a portion in 585 BC, give or take a few, into a work that's very much like what we have today. It was a blending of two narratives from two separate people. They had kind of stolen or taken the ideas from and woven it together, and of course other people around knew about all this, and it kind of tried to put it together for everybody. Didn't go over too well, and took a while to get locked in, and of course then we have the Dark Ages and the people just not knowing, and then the searching for concepts. So now the two sources can be identified in the creation narrative as P, you see, and J, which is be the Yahwistic. Of course, J's weren't created till after the 1300s, which leads you to a weird idea about Jesus and Jews and Judea, but I won't touch on that, but maybe I'll try not to. Anyhow, now these sources here that we're looking at combine the narrative as a critique. Basically, a narrative is a critique on the Mesopotamian theology of creation. Genesis affirms that monotheism, and it denies polytheism or multiple gods. Many people have noted this, that it really seems to be that the things that it mentions are directly the things that are mentioned in the Sumerian one, but trying to attach them to this one guy rather than saying there was a group that made it to happen in the first place, and that they had used Kingu and all these things to make it happen, and killed Kingu, and then he's the dead moon that's up there in the sky. All these concepts that they had, trying to say, no, that's all like my God is over your God. He's a shell over all of this. He's the God of the cosmos, which is On. Well, On is actually the major god of the Sumerian Pantheon. You can't get away from it. He's the god of creation from up there. Then you have the God hovering his face above the waters of the earth, which is a sexual union that spawns forth life. You can't get away from it. In fact, even in the Bible, where it talks about how the earth was null and void, those words are tohu and bohu. Tohu and bohu are the primordial god dragons that fought each other and created our cosmos. We're left as part of Tiamat and Ki, the earth, and its remnants of destruction are cast out and make the Milky Way, and the remnant of Tiamat is left as the asteroid belt that should be there for a planet that's missing in between us and Mars. And astrologers look at this and they go, hey, these people back then, well, no, shh, and you can't pay attention to Sumerian stuff. None of this is about Sumerian stuff. Remember, they hate Babylon and Sumeria. Well, you're like, well, Abraham came from there. That's where they ended up originating from. That's where the flood came from, and later he left. They became idol worshippers, so he cruised, right? Blah, blah, blah. Met Melchizedek, which is actually a priest of Saturn, or El. El is the god of the Levant area that's there. Robert Adler described the combined narrative as compelling in his archetypical character. It's an adaptation of myth and monotheistic ends. So, misunderstanding the genre of Genesis creative narrative, meaning the intention of the authors and the culture within which they wrote, can result in a misreading. In other words, trying to apply modern knowledge towards what they thought of the world back then makes you want to misread it. Bruce Watke, well-known evangelical scholar, cautions against one such reading, the approach which reads it as history rather than theology, and so leads to creationism and denial of the possibility of evolution. As noted scholar Jewish Studies Levinson puts it, how much history lies behind the story of Genesis? Well, because of the action of the primeval story, it's not representative as taking place on the plane of ordinary human history and has so many affinities with ancient mythology. It is a very far-fetched to speak of its narratives as historical at all, though it contains many historical elements. The concept of Genesis itself seems to have been a taken narrative. We're not going to go into all of this, but although tradition attributes Genesis to Moses, biblical scholars hold that it, together with the following 4 books, making it what the Jews call the Torah and biblical scholars call the Pentateuch, is a composite work, the product of many hands and periods of time. A common hypothesis among biblical scholars today is that the first major comprehensive draft of the Pentateuch was compiled in the late 7th or 6th century BC, and the Jawas source, and that this was later expanded by addition of various narratives and laws, which is the priestly source, into a work that they like to be the existing one that we have today, mended together at this much late date. As for the historical background which led to the creation of the narrative itself, a theory which has gained considerable interest, although is still controversial, is a Persian imperial authorization. This proposes that the Persians, after the conquest of Babylon in 538 BC and Cyrus the Great having given them back the land and turning the temple, which used to be a temple of Baal, now into a temple for them, right? Agreed to grant Jerusalem a large measure of local autonomy within the empire, but required the local authorities to produce a single law code, accepted by the entire community, It further purposed that there were two powerful groups in the community: the priestly families who controlled the temple, which was strong in those days, and the landowning families who made up the elders of the community, and that these two groups were in conflict over many issues, that each had its own history of origins. But the Persian promise of greatly increased local autonomy for all if they provided a powerful incentive to cooperate in producing a single text. So they wove it together, and the elite priests of El, along with the elders of the land, took this concept that they had of a multi-theistic idea and wove it into a singularity, which of course had to gel with these ancient Persians. Now, Darius and ones before this time here had always professed that they were Aryans. Darius himself, his name says it, but on his stele it says, he professes it straightforward, that he is an Aryan. Conspicuously, Herodotus mentions the Medes and the Persians when he's talking about the Egyptians and Colchians, and relating how all these people used to be named one name, but the Medes, who were called Aryans, were changed their name to the Medes, or Media as we know it, whenever Medes had come to them from Athens, as Perseus had done to Persia. And so this is whenever lands that may have been one unity of name, or one concept of a people having a certain name, which would have been Aryans, which can't be talked about now in a modern society. We have to say things like Proto-Indo-Europeans, and everybody's totally cool with it. And the Proto-Indo-Europeans had swastikas that date all the way back into the time of mammoths. And that's cool too. But if you were to say, well, they're called Aryans by a lot of other people, and Hitler found that out, and so he thought, hey, and it went, no, you can't say that. See, that's anti-Semitic. Well, what is Semitic? Well, I'm telling you, it's a conglomeration here put together for things like this concept. Now, is this idea put together correctly? I'm not sure, but the narrative's definitely made of a few stories, and people say, well, Moses wrote the books, and you go, well, no, he didn't, because it talks about his own death and things that happen afterwards and stuff, and from third person's point of view, quite often it can't be. In fact, you see them looking at it, you can tell by the way they write it down and speak that it's done in different times. It's done, and it's all kind of put together, and when they didn't even change it, they just put it together. You can almost see it woven. Show you something interesting from a Yale scholar, Jewish lady.
Bible's explanation for the name Yahweh. There are certain important and unique features of this burning bush dialogue. First, God identifies himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He reveals to Moses a new name, Yahweh, so that Yahwism and the Yahweh cult can be said to begin only with Moses. Exodus 6, verses 2 to 4, very important passage. Exodus 6, verses 2 to 4. And here God says, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name, Yahweh. Now this contradicts the J source. And many scholars have suggested that P and E preserve a memory of a time when Israel worshipped the Canaanite god El. P and E wish to claim that the God who covenanted with the patriarchs is the God of the Exodus, but now with a new name. God is 6 times called El Shaddai. Other names are El Elyon, El Olam, El Roi, El Bethel. You can see the translations of these. The everlasting God, God Most High, a God of seeing, a God of the house of God, and so on. El is the name of the chief god in the Canaanite Pantheon. It's an important set of texts that were discovered at a place called Ras Shamra. Ras Shamra was ancient Ugarit. In 1928, a peasant in Syria discovered a tomb at Ras Shamra, which was subsequently excavated by the French, and it was found to contain a library of tablets that were written in a language very, very close to Biblical Hebrew. It's clear that Hebrew is simply a Canaanite dialect. In fact, I remember reading one scholar said if you go back far enough, you're really hard-pressed to tell the difference between Canaanite and Hebrew. And in these texts, we read of the exploits of the gods of Canaanite religion. These gods include the sky god El, I've listed here, the father of the various gods and humans. El has a wife, Asherah, she's listed third on your paper, a mother goddess, their daughter Anat, who is a goddess of love and war, she's quite fierce, and then their son Baal, who is a storm god. He's depicted in mythological literature as defeating both the chaotic sea god, the sea god Yam, and the god of death, Mot. There are striking resemblances between the biblical god of the patriarchs and the Canaanite god El. El is the head of the council of gods. He is said to have a long white beard. He dwells on a mountain top in a tent. His epithets include father of all creatures, bull, king. He is also described as the protector of patriarchs, patriarchal figures, a god of the father of the clan, it says in the text. He guides them, he protects them, he promises them descendants. Many biblical passages depict God exactly this way, as the head of a council of divine beings. He's occasionally described with some of the epithets that are associated with El. He's referred to as the father of all creatures. There are poetic passages in which he is referred to as bull, also certainly as king. And in the patriarchal narratives, God refers to himself as the God of the Father. I am the God of the Father, the same way El is referred to. He guides and protects the patriarchs. He makes promises of progeny to Abraham and his heirs. He also is associated with a mountaintop, Sinai, and gives instructions for the building of a tabernacle, a tent-like structure in which he will dwell. Many personal and place names in the patriarchal narratives are compounds in which one element is El. Yisrael, Yishmael, Beit El. El is the God of the patriarchs. By contrast, after the time of Moses, Israelite names start to be formed using Yah or Yahu as part of the name Yahweh. Elijah in Hebrew is Eliyahu. So you start to have theophorics, names that use the name of a deity, which are using forms of Yahu instead of El.
Yahoo! Are you sure you know whose God you're worshiping?